Hi, I'm Reverend Jake Zabe, and welcome to Children's Bible Stories. Alright children, our Bible story for today is going to be the story of Saul's conversion. And the Saul we're talking about is not King Saul of the Old Testament, but the Apostle Paul of the New Testament. So before he was called Paul, his Jewish name was Saul, named after King Saul. And Saul had been persecuting the church. He'd been arresting Christians and having them stoned to death for teaching blasphemy. Which, what is blasphemy, children?
Lies.
Yeah, and false
teaching.
Yeah. And so they were being killed for teaching bad things. And the bad things they were teaching were actually true things. That Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus rose from the dead, and that Jesus is God. Those are true things, but the Jews don't believe those, so the Jews consider those things to be blasphemies. And Saul had heard that the Christian church was now spreading beyond Jerusalem to other places like Damascus. And so Saul had gone and got letters of permission from the high priest in Jerusalem to go up to Damascus and to go to the synagogues, which are what, children? A synagogue is
the church where the Jews gather.
Yeah, so kind of like a church. So before the church was established under the Christians, the Jews used to gather in things called synagogues, which are very similar to like how we gather in church these days. And Saul got permission to go up to Damascus, and if he found anyone there amongst the Jews who was actually a Christian, he was to arrest them, drag them back to Jerusalem, and have them killed. So Saul went off to Damascus. Now, Saul was, even though he was a young man still, he was a genius, and he rose through the ranks really quickly, and he became like a Pharisee elder even before he was old enough. So Saul wasn't just an ordinary Jew, he was kind of a leader amongst the Jews, and he probably took with him some guards, not centurions or Roman soldiers. He would have taken with him like the Jewish guards, like the ones that had arrested Jesus on the night when Jesus was betrayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. So he would have taken probably people like that. They would have been like the Jewish police, kind of. And while the Bible does not mention Saul going on a horse, many of the early pictures and medieval pictures, and if you get a children's Bible, many of the pictures will have Saul riding on a horse. Like I said, the Bible doesn't mention Saul having a horse. He may not have, he may have, he may not have, we don't know. Often they have him on a horse because it makes the picture look a lot cooler. And as Saul was riding off to Damascus, who appeared before him?
Jesus.
That's right. Jesus appeared before Saul in a blinding light, and Saul was knocked to the ground from the blinding light. And what is interesting is this wasn't just a vision of Jesus, as if Saul was seeing things. Saul tells us that this is actually a resurrection appearance of Jesus. See, Saul in the books of like Galatians and Corinthians explains that in order to be an apostle, you had to be sent by the earthly Jesus, Jesus on earth. But by the time Saul was doing his persecutions, Jesus had already ascended to heaven. But later when Saul, now named Paul, writes his epistle to the Corinthians, he gives a list of resurrection appearances. He mentions how Jesus had appeared to Peter, to the 11 apostles, how he had appeared to a large group of 500 people, how he had appeared to all the apostles, and how he had appeared to St. James. And he says how he had also appeared to Paul. So in doing that, Paul is saying, look, when Jesus appeared to me on the road to Damascus, this wasn't a vision. This wasn't an illusion. This was the actual resurrected Jesus who had ascended to heaven, back on earth again, not for the second coming, but for a special resurrection appearance to Saul. And this is actually important, because this isn't the second coming of Jesus, and yet Jesus is back on earth. And this happens to do with something that we call the communion of
Attribute.
Now, the communion of attributes is that Jesus is fully
God.
and fully,
Me.
but are there two Jesuses?
No.
There is one Jesus who is fully God and fully man. So when Jesus does anything, he doesn't do it as just man or just God. He does it as both man and God. Now, there are things that we call attributes. Those are things that belong to one of the two natures. So being born and dying and walking around on earth in a physical body, that is part of Jesus's human attributes. But because Jesus is also God, God is able to be present everywhere, and that is part of his divine or God attributes. And so that's how Jesus is able to be present everywhere in Holy Communion, because he has the divine attribute of being present everywhere. But when Jesus does anything, his human nature and his divine nature share those attributes in common. So when Jesus is present everywhere, he's not present everywhere just as God, but as man. Which means that Jesus, he allows his human body to go wherever it wants. As Martin Luther, the reformer, once says, after the resurrection, when Jesus made full use of his divine powers, his body was no longer bound to time or space, but could appear whenever and wherever Jesus wanted to. So that's how you can have like the physical body of Jesus appearing in the Old Testament to wrestle with guys like Jacob, even before Jesus had been born. And also how Jesus can appear to Saul on the road to Damascus, even though his body had ascended into heaven. Because Jesus' body is allowed to be wherever and whenever he wants it to be. So even though Jesus is ascended to the right hand of the Father, his body can pop up wherever Jesus wants it to pop up. And if Jesus wants his body to pop up on earth before Saul on the road to Damascus, Jesus can do that. Because of the communion of
Attribute.
Well done, children. And so Jesus appears to Saul and he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Hold on. Who was Saul persecuting? Was he killing Jesus?
No.
Who was he killing?
Christian.
Yeah. But who did Jesus say Saul was killing?
Him.
And that's something to do with another communion that we call the mystical union. Do you know what that is, children? That is how the Christian and Jesus are united as one. As Jesus says, just as he and the Father are one, so too God and the Christian are one. As we have in other places in Paul's writings, we'll say things where like, when we are baptized, we are clothed in Jesus. Or that through baptism we are united to the death and resurrection of Jesus. As Christians, we are united with
Jesus.
Yeah. So when the church is persecuted, Jesus is persecuted. If Jesus is persecuted, the church is persecuted. So If people attack Jesus, they're attacking the Christians. And if they attack the Christians, they are attacking
Jesus.
So Jesus says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul says, what? Who are you? And Jesus says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And Saul, by this stage, he'd been knocked to the ground from the dazzling light. But Jesus said to him, get up, rise, enter the city, and you will do what I tell you. And at this point in time, the men who were traveling with Saul, they were shocked and they were speechless because they could hear the voice speaking, but they were not able to see Jesus. So Jesus was able to show himself to Saul, but he was also able to allow himself not to be seen by other people. And so even though they could hear this voice speaking, they were like, what's going on? Well, actually, they didn't even say what was going on. The Bible says they were speechless and were like, huh? What? Huh? They have no idea what's happening. They could hear this voice. They could see Saul knocked to the ground, but they didn't see the bright light. They didn't see Jesus appear before Saul. So they didn't know what was going on. And even more so, at this point in time, the bright light had struck Saul blind. So he couldn't see anymore. And so the men had to help him up, and they had to help him into the city. And that is probably part 1 of the conversion of Saul. In our next video, we're going to finish up the conversion of Saul by discussing the baptism of Saul. So I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.